At dawn, when most of the front lines were unusually quiet, a single Ukrainian combat jet cut through the low clouds, flying fast and dangerously close to the terrain. Its mission was risky, precise, and controversial: strike a Russian-controlled dam that had become a critical military asset. What followed was not just an explosion, but a chain reaction that reshaped the battlefield and shocked military analysts on both sides. For months, the dam had been more than concrete and water. Under Russian control, it had quietly transformed into a logistical lifeline. Satellite imagery and intercepted communications suggested that the structure was being used to regulate water levels for river crossings, protect pontoon bridges downstream, and supply electricity to nearby command centers. In a war defined by artillery duels and drone swarms, the dam stood as a silent force multiplier, one that Ukraine had been watching carefully. Ukrainian planners knew the risks. Striking infrastructure carries enormous consequences, not only militarily but also politically and environmentally. A miscalculation could flood civilian areas, damage ecosystems, or provoke international backlash. Yet the intelligence picture grew more alarming by the week. Russian units were reinforcing positions along the riverbanks, rotating fresh troops using protected crossings, and stockpiling fuel and ammunition behind the dam's cover. The structure wasn't just supporting operations, it was enabling them. The decision, according to sources familiar with the planning, came after weeks of debate. Alternatives were considered: sabotage teams, long-range missiles, cyber operations. Each had limitations. Ground teams risked capture. Missiles were scarce and needed elsewhere. Cyber options offered disruption, not certainty. In the end, air power, fast, precise, and fleeting, offered the best chance to achieve surprise. The jet's approach was designed to evade detection, flying low to avoid radar. The pilot used terrain masking, hugging the contours of the land. Russian air defenses in the region were layered but overstretched, tasked with protecting depots, bridges, and forward units simultaneously. The window was narrow. If detected early, the aircraft would face a wall of surface-to-air fire. Moments before the strike, the dam appeared through the haze, massive, immovable, and deceptively calm. The pilot released the ordnance in a carefully calculated run, aiming not for total destruction, but for critical control points. The goal was disruption, not collapse. Seconds later, the jet pulled away, accelerating hard as explosions rippled across the structure. The initial impact stunned observers. The dam did not burst dramatically as some feared. Instead, targeted sections were damaged, control mechanisms disabled, and power systems knocked offline. Water flow became erratic. Downstream levels shifted unpredictably. Within hours, Russian engineers scrambled to assess the damage, while military units reported immediate complications. Bridges downstream became harder to use as currents changed. Pontoon crossings, carefully calibrated for steady flow, were suddenly unstable. Vehicles stalled. Supply convoys halted. Communications, dependent on local power feeds, flickered. What had been a quiet advantage turned into a logistical headache. But the real surprise came next. Rather than escalating immediately, Ukraine paused. No follow-up strike, no public declaration. The silence created confusion. Russian commanders, unsure whether another attack was imminent, began redeploying air defenses to protect other dams and crossings. Units that had been preparing for offensive action were ordered to dig in. Engineers diverted from front-line fortifications to emergency repairs. This pause amplified the effect of the strike. By forcing Russia to react defensively across a wide area, Ukraine gained time and space elsewhere. Artillery pressure eased in some sectors. Drone units reported fewer coordinated movements. The battlefield rhythm changed. International reaction was swift and cautious. Analysts debated whether the strike marked a new phase of infrastructure targeting or a one-off operation driven by necessity. Environmental experts monitored water levels closely, noting that while localized flooding occurred, catastrophic outcomes had been avoided. Diplomats urged restraint, while acknowledging the dam's clear military role. On Russian state media, the narrative shifted by the hour. Initial reports downplayed the damage, calling it minor. Later segments accused Ukraine of reckless escalation. Yet leaked footage and eyewitness accounts told a different story: engineers working around the clock, temporary barriers erected, and military traffic rerouted miles away. For Ukrainian officials, the message was measured. No triumphalism, no detailed briefings, just a simple emphasis on military necessity and precision. The restraint itself sent a signal this was not about spectacle, but about strategy. As night fell on the first day after the strike, the dam remained standing, but altered. Its reliability, once taken for granted, was gone. Every decision downstream now carried uncertainty. And in war, uncertainty is a weapon. What happened next would ripple far beyond the riverbanks. The strike forced both sides to reconsider assumptions about protected infrastructure, air defense priorities, and the balance between restraint and resolve. In the days ahead, the consequences would grow clearer on the front lines, in command rooms, and across the international stage. The true impact of the strike did not reveal itself in explosions or headlines, but in the hours and days that followed inside command centers, along supply routes, and across sections of the front line that suddenly went quiet. What Ukraine had disrupted was not just a dam, but a rhythm Russia had come to rely on. Within 24 hours, Russian field commanders began reporting cascading problems. Fuel deliveries arrived late or not at all. Ammunition convoys were forced to take longer, exposed routes. Units that had been rotated regularly found themselves stuck in place, growing fatigued and increasingly cautious. The dam had acted like a stabilizer in the system. Once damaged, everything downstream became less predictable. One of the most immediate consequences was the breakdown of coordination. River crossings that had been synchronized with artillery schedules and troop movements could no longer be used with confidence. Even small changes in water flow mattered. A delay of minutes could turn into hours. In modern warfare, where timing is everything, those delays were costly. Ukrainian reconnaissance units noticed the shift almost immediately. Drone feeds showed Russian vehicles parked in unusual locations, waiting for clearance or alternative routes. Pontoon bridge crews were observed dismantling and rebuilding crossings repeatedly, struggling to adapt to fluctuating currents. What had once been routine now required constant improvisation. This uncertainty began to affect decision-making at higher levels. Russian planners, facing incomplete information, slowed the pace of operations. Planned offensives were postponed. Artillery fire became less concentrated as logistics struggled to keep up. Defensive postures hardened, not because of Ukrainian pressure alone, but because Russian commanders could no longer be sure their support systems would function as expected. Meanwhile, Ukraine exploited the moment without overplaying its hand. Instead of launching large-scale assaults, Ukrainian forces focused on selective pressure. Precision strikes targeted supply depots already strained by rerouting. Electronic warfare units disrupted communications just long enough to compound confusion. The idea was simple: let the disruption spread on its own. Every Russian attempt to fix the problem created new vulnerabilities elsewhere. The dam strike also forced a major reallocation of Russian air defenses. Systems that had been protecting frontline units were pulled back to guard critical infrastructure. This thinning of coverage created gaps Ukrainian pilots and drone operators quickly noticed. Airspace that had once been lethal became briefly permissive, allowing for reconnaissance and limited strikes that would have been impossible weeks earlier. International military analysts began to connect the dots. The strike was no longer viewed as an isolated incident, but as part of a broader operational design. By targeting a dual-use structure with clear military relevance, and doing so in a controlled, limited way, Ukraine demonstrated a method of applying pressure without triggering immediate escalation. That calculation appeared to work. Diplomatic channels grew active, but restrained. There were statements of concern, calls for protection of civilian infrastructure, and demands for transparency. Yet behind closed doors, many observers acknowledged the sophistication of the operation. It raised uncomfortable questions about how modern wars redefine what is considered protected, when infrastructure becomes deeply integrated into military systems. Inside Russia, the psychological impact became harder to hide. While official messaging emphasized resilience, reports from the front suggested growing frustration. Soldiers spoke of constant changes to plans, long waits, and unclear orders. Engineers were praised as heroes, but their workload became overwhelming. Fixing the dam was not a simple matter of repairs. It required securing the airspace, rerouting water, stabilizing power systems, and doing all of it under the threat of another strike. And that threat, even without a second attack, proved powerful. Every alarm triggered nervous responses. Every aircraft blip on radar caused units to scatter. The idea that a single jet had penetrated defenses and hit such a critical point lingered. It forced Russia to assume that similar strikes could happen elsewhere at any time. For Ukraine, the restraint continued to speak volumes. Officials avoided public celebration. Military briefings remained vague. This ambiguity became part of the strategy. By not clarifying their next move, Ukraine compelled Russia to prepare for many possibilities at once, stretching resources thin. The environmental dimension also played a role in shaping responses. Monitoring teams reported localized flooding and ecological stress, but no catastrophic damage. This outcome undercut claims of recklessness and strengthened Ukraine's argument that the strike had been carefully calibrated. Precision, not devastation, had been the goal. As days turned into a week, the broader implications became clearer. The strike had altered how both sides viewed critical infrastructure. Dams, power stations, and transport hubs were no longer just background elements, they were active components of military planning. Protecting them required trade-offs, and every trade-off weakened something else. Perhaps the most surprising effect was the pause it created. In a war often defined by constant escalation, the dam strike introduced a moment of recalculation. Both sides slowed, reassessed, and adjusted. That pause gave Ukraine breathing room in key sectors and complicated Russian efforts to regain momentum. By the end of the second week, repairs were underway, but the dam never fully returned to its previous role. Temporary fixes replaced reliable systems. Backup plans became permanent. Confidence was replaced by caution. And that, many analysts agreed, was the real victory. Ukraine had shown that it could strike deep, precisely, and with restraint, reshaping the battlefield without triggering immediate escalation. Russia had been forced to react, divert, and defend, all while maintaining a public image of control. The jet's strike lasted seconds. Its consequences stretched far longer by the time military planners on both sides fully absorbed the implications of the dam strike. It was already reshaping the next phase of the war. What began as a single, carefully calibrated air operation evolved into a case study that commanders, analysts, and policymakers would dissect for months. Part 3 is not about the explosion itself, but about doctrine psychology and how one restrained strike quietly rewrote assumptions about modern warfare. A turning point in targeting doctrine. For decades, critical infrastructure such as dams occupied a gray zone in military thinking. They were often considered too dangerous to target outright, too politically sensitive, and too risky due to civilian and environmental consequences. But the war in Ukraine has blurred those lines. Infrastructure is no longer passive. It powers command centers, regulates troop movement, enables logistics, and shapes the battlefield itself. The dam strike forced a reassessment. Military academies and analysts quickly recognized that Ukraine had not treated the dam as a symbol or a terror target, but as a system node, a point where water control, power supply, logistics, and troop mobility converged. The objective was not destruction but functional degradation. This distinction matters. Instead of collapsing the structure and triggering disaster, Ukraine targeted elements that disrupted military use while avoiding worst-case civilian outcomes. This approach marked a shift from destroy to deny toward disrupt to degrade. From that moment on, planners on both sides had to assume that any piece of infrastructure actively supporting military operations could become a legitimate, precision strike target. That realization sent ripples far beyond the immediate area of the dam. Russian strategic recalculation. Inside Russian military planning circles, the strike sparked uncomfortable discussions. The dam had been considered relatively safe, deep behind controlled lines, protected by air defenses, and shielded by the assumption that Ukraine would avoid such targets due to international scrutiny. That assumption was now broken. Russian commanders began conducting vulnerability assessments of other infrastructure assets, hydroelectric stations, rail hubs, fuel pumping stations, and water control facilities. Each assessment raised the same question: how much military reliance is too much? The problem was structural. Russia had integrated civilian infrastructure deeply into its military logistics, not as a temporary measure, but as a necessity. Untangling that integration was neither quick nor easy. Every attempt to harden infrastructure required resources, air defenses, engineering units, personnel. That had to be pulled from somewhere else, and every relocation created new weaknesses. This forced Russia into a defensive mindset across a much wider area. Instead of focusing air defense on frontline units and key offensive assets, coverage had to be spread thinly across dozens of sites. The result was a strategic dilution that Ukraine could exploit without firing another shot. The psychological dimension: fear without follow-up. One of the most striking aspects of the operation was what Ukraine did not do afterward. There was no immediate second strike, no repetition, no escalation. This restraint amplified the psychological impact. Russian units now had to operate under the constant assumption that another strike could happen, anywhere, at any time, but without knowing when or where. This uncertainty is deeply corrosive to planning. It forces commanders to hedge, delay, and over-prepare. Engineers working on repairs had to do so under constant threat. Air defense crews stayed on high alert for days, exhausting personnel and increasing the risk of mistakes. Logistics officers rerouted convoys repeatedly, often choosing longer and less efficient paths just to avoid potential exposure. In warfare, fear does not always come from repeated attacks. Sometimes it comes from the memory of vulnerability. Ukraine had demonstrated capability, precision, and restraint, all three at once. That combination is rare, and it unsettled expectations. A new role for air power. The dam strike also redefined how air power was perceived in this phase of the war. Until then, Ukrainian jets were often seen as constrained, brave but limited by air defenses and numerical disadvantage. The operation challenged that narrative. It showed that Ukrainian aviation could still penetrate defended airspace under the right conditions, using planning, timing, and intelligence rather than brute force. The jet was not used for sustained bombing or air superiority, but as a strategic scalpel. This had two immediate consequences. Russian air defense commanders became more cautious, holding fire longer to avoid revealing positions, which paradoxically created windows of opportunity. Ukrainian planners gained confidence in limited, high-impact air operations when paired with surprise and restraint. The strike did not signal a return to large-scale air campaigns. Instead, it suggested a future where single sorties, carefully chosen, could produce outsized effects. International military lessons. Globally, defense analysts took note. In quiet briefings and internal papers, the dam strike began appearing as an example of calibrated escalation. It demonstrated how a state under pressure could impose costs on a stronger adversary without crossing thresholds that might trigger wider intervention or backlash. Key lessons emerged. Dual-use infrastructure is no longer neutral once it becomes operationally critical. Precision matters more than spectacle in shaping international perception. Restraint can be more destabilizing than repetition because it forces the adversary to plan for uncertainty. These lessons are not limited to Ukraine and Russia. Militaries around the world began reconsidering how they protect infrastructure and how they might target it in future conflicts. The strike quietly influenced thinking far beyond Eastern Europe. Environmental and legal calculations. Another reason the operation resonated was its careful balance of risk. Environmental monitoring showed stress and localized damage, but not catastrophe. This outcome was not accidental, it was part of the planning. By avoiding total collapse, Ukraine limited humanitarian fallout and reduced legal and diplomatic exposure. That mattered. In modern conflicts, military success is increasingly judged not only by battlefield gains, but by compliance with international norms. The strike became an example of how law, ethics, and strategy intersect. It challenged the idea that avoiding infrastructure targets is always the most responsible choice. Instead, it suggested that how a target is struck may be as important as whether it is struck at all. The long-term battlefield effect. Weeks after the strike, the front lines told a quieter story. No dramatic breakthroughs, no sudden collapse, but a subtle shift. Russian operations in the affected sector remained cautious. Logistics never fully regained their previous tempo. Temporary fixes became semi-permanent solutions. Confidence was replaced by contingency planning. Ukraine, meanwhile, benefited from the space created. Forces elsewhere encountered slightly reduced pressure. Planning cycles became more flexible. The psychological initiative, often invisible but decisive, tilted. This is how modern wars change, not always through decisive battles, but through accumulated disruptions that slowly alter behavior. Why everyone was stunned. The shock was not about damage. It was not about flooding. It was not even about the dam itself. The surprise came from how the strike fit into a larger logic. Ukraine showed it could identify a critical military dependency, strike it precisely, limit collateral consequences, and then stop. That combination defied expectations. It unsettled assumptions on the battlefield and in foreign capitals. It suggested a level of strategic maturity that many had underestimated. Looking ahead, the dam still stands. Repairs continue. Water flows, though differently than before. On the surface, life moves on, but the precedent remains. From now on, every commander must ask, which systems are truly protected? Which dependencies create hidden vulnerabilities? And how much restraint is enough to change the enemy's behavior? The Ukrainian jet's mission lasted minutes. Its influence may last years. In wars shaped by drones, data, and perception, sometimes the most powerful strike is the one that forces everyone to rethink what they thought was safe. By the time the immediate shock of the dam strike faded, its deeper consequences were only beginning to take shape. Part 4 looks beyond tactics and doctrine to examine escalation risks, internal pressures, and how one restrained operation quietly altered the political, military, and psychological balance of the war. This is where the story moves from what happened to what it changed, and why neither side could simply return to business as usual. Escalation without explosion. One of the most remarkable aspects of the strike was what didn't happen afterward. There was no rapid spiral of retaliation, no dramatic expansion of target lists, no sudden widening of the conflict. In a war often described as dangerously close to uncontrolled escalation, this moment became an exception. That restraint was not accidental. For Russia, an immediate, highly visible retaliation risked validating the strike's effectiveness. Overreaction would have signaled vulnerability, an admission that the dam mattered more than publicly acknowledged. Underreaction, however, carried its own dangers. It might encourage similar operations elsewhere. The result was a careful, almost hesitant response. Repairs were prioritized. Air defenses were shifted quietly. Messaging focused on resilience rather than revenge. The tone suggested control even as internal documents revealed urgency. For Ukraine, escalation carried even higher risks. Repeating the strike too soon could shift international perception from calculated necessity to pattern of behavior. By stopping after one operation, Ukraine preserved strategic ambiguity and diplomatic space. This mutual restraint created a rare pause, a moment where both sides reassessed rather than reacted. In modern warfare, pauses like this are uncommon and often more consequential than battles. internal pressures inside Russia. While public messaging emphasized calm, internal pressure mounted. The dam strike forced Russian officials to confront an uncomfortable truth. Infrastructure once assumed to be politically untouchable was now exposed if it served military purposes. That realization triggered debates within defense and security circles about priorities, responsibilities, and accountability. Who had approved the dam's use as a military enabler? Who had assessed its vulnerability? Who had assumed Ukraine would not strike? These questions mattered because they pointed to systemic issues rather than isolated mistakes. Infrastructure had been militarized quietly without fully accounting for the strategic risks. Undoing that integration would take time, resources, and political will, none of which were abundant. At the regional level, local administrators faced pressure to reassure civilians while cooperating with military requirements. Balancing water management, power supply, and security became more complex. Every adjustment had trade-offs, and every trade-off carried political cost. For frontline commanders, the message was simpler and more troubling. Assumptions were no longer safe. Ukrainian strategy, winning time, not territory. From the outside, critics asked a familiar question: what did Ukraine gain on the map? The answer, deliberately, was nothing immediate. The dam strike was not designed to seize territory or force a breakthrough. Its objective was time to stabilize other fronts, time to strain enemy logistics, time to force recalculation. In that sense, the operation reflected a mature understanding of asymmetric warfare. When direct confrontation favors the opponent, shaping the environment becomes the goal. Disruption replaces destruction. Delay replaces advance. Ukrainian planners understood that even a small reduction in Russian operational tempo could have outsized effects elsewhere. Fewer shells fired in one sector meant fewer reserves needed in another. A delayed rotation here eased pressure there. The battlefield is interconnected in ways that maps cannot show. By forcing Russia to divert attention inward, to defend, repair, and reassure, Ukraine gained freedom of action without announcing it. The International Balancing Act. Internationally, the strike landed in a narrow space between concern and acknowledgement. Public statements emphasized the protection of civilians and infrastructure. Monitoring bodies watched water levels and environmental indicators closely. Diplomatic channels quietly sought assurances that similar actions would remain limited. Behind the scenes, however, many governments recognized the operational logic. The dam had clear military relevance. The strike avoided catastrophic outcomes. The restraint afterwards suggested control rather than recklessness. This distinction mattered. In modern conflicts, legitimacy is a strategic asset. Ukraine's ability to maintain support depended not just on defending itself, but on how it fought. The dam strike tested that balance, and at least in the short term, held. It also sent a message to allies and adversaries alike. Ukraine was capable of complex, disciplined operations that aligned military necessity with political awareness. A shift in risk calculations. Perhaps the most enduring impact of the strike was how it changed risk calculations on both sides. For Russia, the risk of concentrating logistics around fixed infrastructure increased. Redundancy became a priority, but redundancy costs resources. Dispersal reduced efficiency. Mobility increased vulnerability elsewhere. There was no perfect solution, only compromises. For Ukraine, the strike demonstrated that certain red lines were not as fixed as once believed, provided actions were carefully planned and justified. This did not mean a green light for widespread infrastructure attacks, but it expanded the menu of options. Risk, in this context, became something to manage rather than avoid entirely. The information war after the strike. Information warfare played a subtle but important role in the aftermath. Russia's messaging sought to normalize the event, downplaying damage, emphasizing repairs, portraying the strike as ineffective. Ukraine's messaging did the opposite by saying very little. Silence became a form of control. This asymmetry shaped perception. Excessive explanation can signal insecurity. Minimal commentary, paired with visible consequences on the ground, often speaks louder. Independent analysts filled the gap, dissecting satellite imagery, logistics patterns, and operational shifts. Their conclusions, measured, technical, and widely shared, gave the strike credibility beyond official narratives. In the information age, third-party validation often matters more than propaganda. Long-term military implications. As weeks passed, the dam strike began influencing planning documents and training discussions. For Russia, infrastructure protection became a core mission rather than a secondary concern. This shift strained already stretched air defense networks. Protecting everything meant protecting nothing perfectly. For Ukraine, the operation reinforced the value of intelligence-led targeting. Identifying nodes where multiple systems intersect, logistics, power, mobility, offered leverage disproportionate to the force applied. Both sides began thinking less in terms of lines and more in terms of networks. Why the conflict did not escalate immediately. Observers often ask why such a sensitive strike did not trigger immediate escalation. The answer lies in mutual constraint. Russia faced limits on how much it could escalate without creating new vulnerabilities or political costs. Ukraine faced limits on how far it could push without risking support. Both sides understood these limits, even if they did not publicly acknowledge them. The dam strike sat precisely within that narrow band where action was possible but escalation was optional. That space may not always exist, but in this moment it did, and Ukraine used it. A quiet inflection point. History often marks turning points with dates and battles. Yet many real inflection points are quieter. They are moments when assumptions change, when planning shifts, when confidence erodes or consolidates. The dam strike was one such moment. It did not end the war. It did not decide the front. It did not dominate headlines forever. But it altered behavior. From that point on, infrastructure was no longer background scenery. Air defenses were no longer confidently layered. Logistics were no longer predictably stable. And restraint became, paradoxically, a weapon, setting the stage for what comes next. As this part closes, one thing is clear: the strike's importance lies less in what it destroyed than in what it revealed. It revealed vulnerabilities. It revealed limits. It revealed that control, precision, and timing could reshape a battlefield without dramatic escalation. The war would continue. New offensives would rise and fall. Attention would shift. But beneath those movements, the logic introduced by this single operation would persist, quietly influencing decisions, shaping caution, and reminding both sides that in modern war, certainty is fragile. As the war moved forward and headlines shifted to new offensives and new crises, the dam strike slowly faded from daily news coverage. Yet inside military planning rooms, intelligence briefings, and strategic assessments, it never truly disappeared. Part 5 explores the afterlife of that operation, how its lessons were absorbed, misread, and quietly applied as the conflict evolved. From event to reference point. Weeks after the strike, analysts noticed something subtle but telling. The dam operation began appearing not as a headline, but as a reference point. Officers and experts stopped asking why it happened and started asking what it meant. When discussing logistics failures, planners would say, like after the dam strike. When evaluating air defense gaps, briefers would note the same vulnerabilities exposed then. When debating escalation thresholds, diplomats would quietly mention that operation showed where the line might actually be. In warfare, this shift from shock to shorthand is significant. It means an action has entered institutional memory. Russian adaptation, learning under pressure. Russia did adapt, but adaptation came at a cost. Temporary repairs at the dam stabilized water flow and restored partial functionality, yet the structure never regained its former reliability. Engineers built redundancies, but redundancies required manpower and materials already in short supply. Air defense coverage was strengthened in the region, but that meant thinning coverage elsewhere. More importantly, Russian logistics doctrine adjusted. Commanders reduced reliance on single-node infrastructure and increased dispersion. On paper, this made systems more resilient. In practice, it slowed everything down. Dispersed logistics are harder to protect, harder to coordinate, and easier to disrupt incrementally. This adaptation revealed a paradox. The very steps taken to reduce vulnerability also reduced efficiency. The dam strike had forced Russia into a defensive trade off it could not fully escape. Ukrainian planning, confidence without overreach. For Ukraine, the operation became a proof of concept, but not a template to repeat blindly. Ukrainian planners resisted the temptation to treat the strike as a formula. Instead, they treated it as permission to think creatively about targets, to integrate legal and environmental considerations into operational design, and to trust that restraint could amplify impact rather than weaken it. Subsequent operations reflected this mindset. Fewer dramatic announcements, more emphasis on timing, coordination, and silence. The goal was no longer to surprise the public, but to surprise the opponent. In that sense, the dam strike marked a psychological shift. Ukraine was no longer fighting only to survive or react. It was shaping how the war unfolded. The civilian dimension, one of the most closely watched aspects of the aftermath, was civilian impact. Local communities downstream experienced disruption, anxiety, and uncertainty. Water levels fluctuated, power reliability changed, rumors spread faster than facts. For civilians, the dam was not a military node, it was part of daily life. This reality mattered. Ukraine's careful targeting avoided catastrophe, but it did not eliminate civilian stress. That fact reinforced a hard truth for all sides, even precise. Restrained strikes on infrastructure carry human consequences. Acknowledging those consequences became part of the broader conversation about responsibility and legitimacy. International organizations monitored the situation closely. Their reports, measured, technical, and cautious, helped prevent escalation in rhetoric, even as they underscored the need for vigilance. Information silence as strategy. Perhaps one of the least discussed but most effective aspects of the operation was how Ukraine handled information afterward. There was no victory lap, no detailed breakdown of the strike, no effort to dominate the narrative. Instead, Ukraine allowed independent analysts, satellite imagery, and observable changes on the ground to speak for themselves. This approach reduced the risk of misinterpretation and denied opponents clear rhetorical targets. Silence, in this case, was not absence, it was control. Russia, by contrast, found itself responding repeatedly, clarifying, denying, reframing. Each response kept the issue alive longer than it might have otherwise remained. In modern conflict, controlling when a story ends can be as important as controlling how it begins. Strategic patience pays off. As months passed, the true value of the dam strike became clearer, not in dramatic gains, but in accumulated advantages. Russian operational tempo remained uneven. Infrastructure protection consumed disproportionate resources. Planning cycles slowed as contingencies multiplied. Confidence in safe, rear areas never fully returned. Ukraine, meanwhile, benefited from a modest but meaningful shift in initiative. Even when pressure intensified elsewhere, the memory of the strike lingered, shaping enemy caution. This is what strategic patience looks like, accepting that not every success is visible, immediate, or easily measured. Why the strike still matters. In isolation, the dam strike might appear as one event among many in a long war. But wars are not decided by isolated events, they are shaped by patterns. The pattern here was clear. Identify a critical dependency, apply limited force with precise intent, avoid unnecessary escalation. Let consequences unfold over time. This pattern challenged assumptions on all sides. It suggested that control and discipline could be as disruptive as overwhelming force. It reminded observers that modern warfare is as much about systems as it is about territory. The lingering question, long after repairs were made and attention moved on, one question remained in military circles. If one jet, one strike, and one pause could have this effect, what else might be possible? That question, unanswered, became part of the strategic environment itself. It forced planners to think defensively, creatively, and cautiously. It introduced doubt where certainty had once existed. And in war, doubt can be decisive. closing the chapter. Part 5 closes not with a bang, but with a quiet understanding. The dam still stands. The war continues. No single operation changed everything. Yet something fundamental shifted. Assumptions cracked, confidence eroded, restraint proved powerful. The Ukrainian jet's mission was brief, precise and limited, but its echo traveled far beyond the river it struck. In a conflict defined by endurance, that echo may prove to be one of its most lasting sounds. When historians look back on this phase of the war, they may not circle the dam strike in red ink or label it as a decisive battle. There were no sweeping territorial changes, no instant collapse, no dramatic victory parade. And yet, quietly, unmistakably, something changed. The Ukrainian jet that flew low that morning did more than deliver a precision strike. It challenged assumptions about safety, about restraint, about what power looks like in a modern war. In a conflict often measured by artillery counts and kilometers gained or lost, this operation proved that influence can be exerted without overwhelming force and pressure applied without uncontrolled escalation. The dam still stands. That fact matters. Its survival became part of the message. Ukraine did not seek chaos. It did not aim for spectacle or destruction for its own sake. Instead, it demonstrated control over targeting, over timing, and crucially, over itself. That discipline separated this strike from acts meant to terrorize or intimidate civilians. It reframed the action as strategy rather than provocation. For Russia, the consequences were unavoidable, even without catastrophe. A structure once treated as stable and dependable became a source of uncertainty. Logistics slowed. Planning grew cautious. Air defenses stretched thinner. Engineers worked under pressure. Commanders hesitated where they once advanced confidently. The battlefield did not erupt, it recalibrated. And recalibration in war can be just as powerful as shock. What stunned observers was not the explosion, but the pause that followed. Ukraine did not rush to repeat the act. It did not escalate for momentum or headlines. It allowed uncertainty to do the work. Every Russian response, every redeployment, every repair, every defensive adjustment confirmed the strike's relevance more clearly than any press statement could. The silence after the strike became its loudest echo. Internationally, the operation exposed a reality many preferred not to confront. Modern wars no longer allow infrastructure to remain neutral when it is woven into military systems. Power, water, transport, and control are no longer background elements, they are part of the battlefield itself. The dam strike did not invent this reality, it revealed it. At the same time, it showed that even in this harsh truth, limits still matter. Precision matters. Intent matters. Restraint matters. The difference between destabilization and devastation can be measured not just in weapons used, but in choices avoided. For Ukraine, the strike marked a moment of strategic maturity. It showed a willingness to think beyond immediate gains and instead shape conditions over time. Rather than chasing dramatic victories, Ukraine demonstrated how to win space, political space, operational space, psychological space, inside a larger struggle. For Russia, it was a reminder that depth no longer guarantees safety, and that reliance on fixed systems creates vulnerabilities that cannot always be armored or concealed. The war was no longer only about holding lines, but about protecting networks. For the world, the lesson was sobering. Conflicts like this will not be decided solely by numbers or firepower. They will be shaped by intelligence, perception, restraint, and the ability to impose costs without triggering uncontrollable consequences. The dam strike was not the loudest moment of the war. It was not the bloodiest. It was not the most visually dramatic. But it was one of the most instructive. It showed how a single operation, executed with precision, followed by restraint, and amplified by silence, could ripple outward, changing behavior long after the smoke cleared. It reminded everyone watching that in modern warfare, power is often exercised not through constant escalation, but through carefully chosen moments that force an adversary to rethink everything they thought was secure. Wars rarely turn on one action alone. They turn on accumulated doubts, altered habits, and broken assumptions. That is what this strike achieved. Not a collapse, but a crack. Not chaos, but uncertainty. Not destruction, but disruption. And in a war where certainty is priceless, that may have been the most stunning outcome of all.